Oh, hey there. Guess what? I am dreading every second of recording this video. Well, not really, but I know that it's going to be a beefy one. Ever since I started covering Castlevania videos on this channel, I've been asked when I was going to cover this one. After completing my coverage of the 3 GBA games and then the 3 DS games, the initial plan was to just go back and do the 3 NES games and then work forward from there, ultimately ending with this game. But honestly, after covering 6 games that live on in the shadow of this absolute Goliath, I figured that it was probably time to shine the spotlight on this one. That's right, this is just another video about Castlevania Symphony of the Night. If you've seen any of my previous Java episodes, then you know that I like to break down the history and development of the game, how I came across it, what the game actually is, and then my overall thoughts and feelings on it. But to be frank, covering Symphony of the Night is a daunting task. It has numerous ports with all sorts of different version differences among them. So to help me break all this down, I've asked for some help from Dr4gonBlitz, a fellow YouTuber with a vast knowledge of Symphony of the Night and all of its different iterations. He holds numerous world records for speedrunning Soten being Symphony of the Night, on basically every platform imaginable. And hey, even 6th place on RC Helicopter on the PS2. Anyway, I'll be throwing it over from him to time to help me tackle this absolute behemoth of a game. His channels will be linked in the description, so be sure to check those out as well. In 1994, Konami started development on a new Castlevania game, nowadays referred to as Castlevania The Bloodletting. It was being created for the Sega 32X. Yes, the doomed Sega peripheral that plugged directly into the top of a Sega Genesis to play 32-bit cartridges such as Knuckles Chaotix, and, well, that's really the only game that I owned for it, and probably the only game that really anybody else even knew about to begin with. There was supposedly a playable prototype, but Konami decided that they were going to focus on developing games for the Sony PlayStation instead, resulting in the game being cancelled. So why am I talking about this if it isn't actually Symphony of the Night? Well, because game development is a lot less straightforward than people realize, with ideas and assets from previous projects being recycled into new projects, which is sort of what happened here. While we don't know much about Castlevania the Bloodletting, we do know that it was going to have Richter Belmont, Maria Renard, and possibly a rival of some sort. The Richter sprite that was created for the 32X was actually recolored and used to make the fake Trevor sprite in Symphony of the Night. So in a way, it could be said that development of Symphony of the Night started in 1994, albeit unofficially. Once Konami shifted over to the Sony PlayStation, Toru Hagahara was brought on to both direct and produce the game, as he had directed the previous entry in the series, Rondo of Blood. Koji Igarashi was assisting in writing the story and programming, but also had creative influence. He was eventually promoted to assistant director and asked to finish the game when Hagahara was promoted to the head of the division. This is a bit of a personal gripe, but when people talk about Symphony of the Night, they often give Koji Igarashi all of the credit. But without Hagahara, we wouldn't have even had Rondo of Blood, which this game takes a lot of inspiration from. And without the rest of the development team, we wouldn't have had Symphony of the Night. That's not to say that Koji Igarashi doesn't deserve a load of credit, especially in the creative department, but I just think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of developers worked on this game, as well as other Castlevania games. According to some old interviews with Igarashi, they'd planned on taking the series in a new direction after seeing dozens of Castlevania games in bargain bins in Japanese video game stores. He said that he felt regular action games were too short, so he wanted to make a game that could be enjoyed for a long time. Taking inspiration from The Legend of Zelda, as well as Castlevania II Simon's Quest, the team designed the castle in a way that would prevent players from accessing most parts of it until they found the proper item, usually some form of equipment that would act as a key to allow players to access to a new area. The idea was to reward players for exploring. On the art side of things, this is actually Ayama Kojima's debut into the video game industry, working as the game's character designer. If you've watched my Java on the later Castlevania games, then you know that I'm a pretty big fan of her work. As for the audio, it was composed by the fantastic Mishiru Yamane, with this being the second Castlevania game she worked on after Castlevania Bloodlines on the Sega Genesis. Whenever I bring up Mishiru Yamane, I can't help but sing her praises, because she is truly talented. Her work on Castlevania Symphony of the Night is absolutely legendary, and she brings to life every single location in this game with her music. With this game being released on the PlayStation, it meant that they had room for higher quality audio tracks. A lot of the later Castlevania games, released on the DS and the GBA, also had amazing soundtracks. Well, most of them, but they were still limited to the hardware that they were released on. Because of that, the songs themselves, while still sounding great, had to be compressed to hell and back. On the PlayStation, each track is like audible chocolate. The beginning theme, Dracula's Castle, starts off sounding spooky, almost like Halloween music, with a faint, ominous wind sound effect blowing in the background, before transforming into a slightly more upbeat, heroic-sounding theme. It invokes the feeling that this is a hero's journey, but it's going to be an uphill battle. The song in the Alchemy Laboratory, Dance of Gold, really does make me think of some sort of fantasy laboratory, as the instruments used here are all very whimsical sounding, almost as if ripped straight from Disney's Fantasia. And let's not forget when you walk through that door into the underground caverns. At first, all you hear is this soft synthesizer and this quiet, simple bass line. The drums kick in, giving this nice, pleasant feeling as you explore these stone hallways. But then, 34 seconds in, you're hit with this piano, and it just makes you want to melt. I absolutely love this song. The surprise piano is just as good as the surprise caverns you find when you jump into the large pit. In fact, I was listening to this song on repeat while writing this script. Now, I could go on and on about the music in this game, but we haven't even talked about the release, or, well, anything yet, so we're going to shelve that for now. But it will come back up later on because of some odd choices that were made. In 1997, Symphony of the Night was released, debuting in Japan on March 20th, in the US on October 3rd, and finally over in Europe in November. Being the progenitor of the style of Castlevania moving forward, and eventually making it onto numerous best video game of all times lists, this game sold like crazy, is what I would like to say, but it actually sold very poorly. Believe it or not, Castlevania Symphony of the Night was a bit of a flop. Of course, there are numerous reasons for why that is. At the time of release, the industry was shifting away from 2D sprites and into 3D models. It received very little funding for production in North America and almost no advertising. So surprisingly, this groundbreaking game was neither a critical nor financial success. In 1998, it got a re-release as a part of the PlayStation Greatest Hits, which did help to boost sales, as well as the port over on the Sega Saturn, with the playable Maria, which yes, I promise we will get to in great detail later on, so just keep watching. Over the years, there were numerous re-releases of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, first showing up on the Xbox 360 as part of Xbox Live Arcade. This was based on the PS1 version of the game, with the port being handled by Backbone Entertainment as opposed to Konami themselves. This was the first Xbox Live Arcade title to exceed the file restriction for games on the service at the time. But even then, it still had to have the full motion video sequences cut. There are some other changes, but again, we'll get into those soon. In 2007, it was released on the PlayStation Network as a part of the PS1 classics, but this version was much more similar to the actual PS1 disc as opposed to the port over in the Xbox 360. In 2012, there was yet another port of Symphony of the Night, this time as a secret unlockable game in Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles, a PSP game. The Dracula X Chronicles is a remake of Rondo of Blood, the game that precedes Symphony of the Night, but now Symphony of the Night is appearing in as a secret game, and can you see why I was so hesitant to cover this game? There's just so much information to get to. I'm having flashbacks of my Slowpoke video. Anyway, this port was also quite a bit different, even though it was also based on the original PlayStation 1 version. Due to the PSP having less buttons than a PlayStation 1 controller, they actually had to change around the button configurations a little bit. It also had a playable Maria, but not the same playable Maria as the Sega Saturn version, because you know, nothing about this game is simple. Later on in 2018, it was ported yet again with the release of the Castlevania Requiem compilation. This port was actually taken directly from the PSP Dracula X Chronicles version. And finally, in 2020, Android and iOS received their own port, which were also based on the Dracula X Chronicles version. Oh right, let's not forget about the absolutely ridiculous Tiger Electronics Game.com version that was also being developed back in 1999. It never got an official release, but because it was recently dumped on the internet, we might as well talk about that one too. I know it's a lot of information and we haven't even talked about the game yet, which is precisely why I am bringing on Dragon.Blitz. I promise he is going to be in this video somewhere at some point in time to help me break down all these different version differences and their pros and their cons. We're gonna get there. This video is a mess. So then, how did I find this game? Well, if you've watched any of my previous Castlevania videos, then you already know that I'm a lifelong Castlevania fan. I grew up with the original series on the NES, but I didn't get back into the series until this game.
All the way back in the 90s, a friend of mine used to tell me about this amazing game he had gotten, being Castlevania Symphony of the Night. He explained to me that it was different than the older Castlevania games, because this time, you played as Dracula's son. 11-year-old me didn't really know what that meant, because even though I had technically already done that back in Castlevania 3, I was, a kid, and didn't even realize that this dude was the son of Dracula. Regardless though, the more he talked about the game, the more I wanted it. I begged my mom to get it for me. But a title like Castlevania Symphony of the Night was impossible for me to remember, so I just described what I was told instead. She ended up getting me a used copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula for the Sega Genesis from a half-price books. Yep, this is what I was playing instead of Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I later gave her a better description of the game, telling her that you played as a vampire and could turn into a bat, wolf, mist, and most importantly that it was on the PlayStation. The next time Mom went out, she surprised me with a game that I had been describing to her. A PlayStation game where you played as a vampire and you could take the form of a mist, wolf, or a bat. And she handed me Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. Which, I can't even blame her when it literally has those words on the back cover. I actually ended up loving that game. But yes, essentially, I was having my own real-life Simpsons moment of my mom getting me Lee Carvalho's putting challenge when all I really wanted was Bone Storm. But I didn't have the heart to tell her it was the wrong game. So eventually, I just borrowed it from my friend. And holy shit, to say that this game blew me away is an absolute understatement. So let's talk about what this game actually is. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is the first of many titles that would be referred to as Metroidvanias or Igavanias. But because using game titles to describe other games is dumb, we'll call it what it is. An exploration-based action platformer with some light RPG elements. You start the game on the final stage of Castlevania Rondo of Blood, taking the role of Richter Belmont. It's a short intro, with you fighting Dracula in an unlosable battle, simply to set the stage for our story. After this, we're given a prologue, explaining what just happened, and that 4 years have passed with Richter suddenly disappearing, and Dracula's castle mysteriously reappearing. Enter Alucard, the son of Dracula, and the very same Alucard that assisted Trevor back in Castlevania 3. This is who we take the role of for the majority of the game. Unlike the Belmonts in the games that precede this, Alucard's movement is no longer stiff, nor does he fight with a whip. Instead, Alucard's controls, like his animations, are buttery smooth. He's got a decent walk speed with a pretty high jump, even having free movement while in the air. He also has access to a backdash as well, which can be useful, but we'll talk more about that in just a bit, because boy do I have some thoughts. Alucard has access to the same types of sub-weapons seen throughout other Castlevania games, such as knives, holy water, stopwatch, and more. These of course take hearts to use, which can be found by breaking candles once you acquire the right relic. But more on those in a bit. Lastly, being half vampire, Alucard has access to various spells he can cast. Throughout the game, you'll be able to buy spell scrolls, which show you the command necessary to perform spells. That being said, if you already know the spells, for instance, if you're on a second playthrough and have them all memorized, you can actually perform them prior to even buying the scrolls as long as you have the MP to do so. As you explore, you'll find weapons, but you'll also find various accessories and armors, including capes that actually do change the color of Alucard's sprite. You'll also come across relics. Relics are rare items, some of which act as the keys to various parts of the castle, often granting Alucard new abilities, such as the ability to double jump, transform into a wolf, bat, or mist, and even super jump. Some relics will summon a familiar to Alucard's side that can fight and even level up alongside him. Compared to the games that come after it, Symphony of the Night has a lot of relics, clocking in at nearly 30, with a couple extra Saturn and PSP exclusives. When developing Soten, the goal was to make a game that players could spend a long time exploring and playing. No longer were there going to be the linear stages of the older Castlevania games. Instead, you would be free, somewhat, to explore the entire castle. At first, the game might feel a bit linear, as you're funneled through the entrance into the alchemy laboratory and into the marble gallery, then out to the castle wall. Sure, you'll find an occasional branch in the path, but these usually just lead to a small item or piece of equipment. It's actually pretty clever because this gives players the illusion of more freedom than there actually is. However, once you reach the outer wall, things start to change. From the outer wall, you can head into the top floor, but you'll quickly reach a dead end, leaving the only other place to go being the long library. As you explore the library, you'll come across the Librarian, acting as this game's shop. Here you can check the bestiary, purchase new items and equipment, and even watch videos of what I assume is a dev fighting each boss you've encountered, but with really bad equipment for some reason. I actually love these though, because they play so perfectly. It's just still an unnecessary addition. So what are you supposed to do then? Well, when you browse the Librarian's inventory, you might notice he sells the Jewel of Open, which is a relic, and absolutely required to progress the game on a casual playthrough. This is actually one of my first minor gripes with the game. There are quite a few instances where a first-time player might suddenly realize they have no idea where to go, because Symphony of the Night doesn't do a very good job of guiding the player, and if you happen to miss something, you could spend a lot of time backtracking hoping you can find it.
I know this part might sound a bit nitpicky for those of you who have already played and beaten this game, but hear me out and try to think about this from the perspective of somebody who's never seen nor played Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
Take for instance the Jewel of Open. It's such an easily overlooked item, and once you acquire it, it's still entirely possible that the only 2 doors it's used on you probably haven't even seen yet, purely because of the stage design. You see, there's a blue door located here in the Marble Gallery, but it's a bit off the beaten path. The game sort of funnels you past it, so if you by chance didn't go this direction, you'll miss it. But let's say you did find this door, and remember to go back to it. Doing so will lead you to a button on the ground when pressed doesn't do anything obvious, when it in fact opens up the floor here, allowing you to get an attack potion and library card. Some players might not realize it though, that it opened up 2 floor panels, because if you head farther left, you'll encounter another one. And look at that, you're in a brand new area. Progress, right?
Nope.
Because as cool as the underground caverns are, at this point in the game, there is nothing here that leads to any sort of game progress. Once again, you'll find yourself being funneled in a set direction. If you head all the way to the left and jump down the giant waterfall, then head farther left, you'll run into the boatman. He'll ferry you over to an area containing the merman statue. This summons the boatman in a location that he doesn't normally appear. Where's that? Oh, it's on the far right side of the underground cavern. But you can't get there now because you jumped down the waterfall. So your only choice is to follow the only open path available to you, leading you back to the castle entrance. From here, you'll either need to hop in a teleporter, assuming you found the one on the outer wall.
Alright, this game has teleporters scattered around the castle, by the way. You can quickly tell which area you're in based off of the animal head that appears in the background, which I think is a great feature and something that later Castlevania games actually omit. Also, these 2 dudes are just hanging out with junk on full display, so that's fun.
Anyway, if you didn't find that teleporter, you'll need to go back through the alchemy laboratory, back into the marble gallery, and eventually return to the underground caverns. Except you still can't find the boatman? Oh, it's because he's in a hidden area that you have to break the ground to find. Once you do find him though, he'll take you to a brand new relic, the holy symbol. Progress, right?
No, of course not. This relic just makes it so you don't take damage while fully submerged in water. And because there are no mandatory areas that you have to explore underwater, it's kind of pointless.
So what were you supposed to do? Well, you were supposed to go to the alchemy laboratory, jump off this platform here, and go to the left side of the screen, leading to another blue door that actually does lead to some progress, as you'll go through the chapel, reach the top floor, and eventually find the double jump. But here's the thing, that's not the only example of poor progression in Symphony of the Night. The Form of Mist is located in an area that requires the player to be lucky enough to see a statue to move in the central clock room, as the statue on the left is on a timer. Every 1 minute, it moves in and out of place, meaning it's entirely possible that players might not see the statue move for a while when just idly walking through the room. Assuming they do see it move and manage to get into Alrox's quarters and then eventually into the Colosseum, they'll find the Form of Mist. But at this point, the only area that players might remember even seeing a gate it could be used at would be the outer wall, which would lead to a dead end. Now, a keen-eyed player might realize that just prior to getting the Mist Relic, you'll find a library card, which I assume was the devs trying to hint to the players to go search the library, since that is where you're supposed to go to find the Form of Bat. But at the same time, you can find a library card just after the first blue door too, so who knows?
Now before any diehard Soten fans start leaving comments, let me just say again that while I do have some issues with some of the progression of the game, again, I called those minor issues for a reason. Because here's the deal, this game was made in 1997, so it was Konami's second attempt at making an open exploration Castlevania game. There wasn't really a playbook on how to do this, so if you ended up wasting a bunch of time exploring the underground caverns or other areas, that's kind of the point of the game too. The developers wanted you to explore, and it could be argued that you were making progress even if it wasn't direct linear story progression. You were still finding items and upgrades and learning new things about each area. So for instance, after getting the double jump with the Form of Bat, maybe you remembered this large gap across from the waterfall and you want to go explore that. But to me personally, when I think back to myself playing it as a smooth-brained 11-year-old, there were just instances where I would get lost and not know where to go next, which is why I thought it's worth mentioning now.
So now that we've talked a bit about the exploration aspect, I want to turn the focus onto where this exploration leads you. Much like the games that came after it,
and Simon's Quest,
Symphony of the Night has multiple endings. It has your typical bad ending, as well as a handful of good endings, which are rewarded to you based off your overall map completion.
Now I am going to talk a bit about the story here. typically when I do these videos, I don't like spoiling too much about the story unless I find it necessary for discussion, but in this case, I find it necessary for discussion. Not that anyone is actually playing this game for its groundbreaking story, but if you absolutely do not want spoilers, then just skip to this timestamp right here. Okay, now that all three of you are gone...
While journeying through the castle, you'll meet Maria Renard, the same character that appeared as a playable character in Rondo of Blood. She informs you that she's searching for Richter Belmont, and lo and behold, you find Richter just before a boss fight takes place. He calls himself the Lord of the Castle before laughing and disappearing. As soon as you obtain the former bat, you can go to the castle keep and get the bad ending, which involves going to the throne room, fighting, and straight up killing Richter Belmont. If you've ever played any other Castlevania games though, you'd already know that something is off. Hell, even if you haven't, you might come to realize that you haven't even run back into death again, and now you're watching the credits, so it could be inferred that there is indeed more to find and do. And there is. That's where the earlier exploration comes into play, because if, instead of going straight to the castle keep, you choose to explore the rest of the castle, you will hopefully, eventually, find the silver and gold rings. Reading their broken descriptions together, you'll find out that you need to wear them in the big clock room. This opens up a secret floor hatch, leading to the final Maria encounter.
How did she even get down here?
Where she gives you the holy glasses. Wearing these during the Richter fight shows a small orb hovering above Richter. You can attack this orb and break it, and voila, it was Shaft controlling Richter the whole time. This is where the game takes a turn. Like, literally, it flips completely upside down, because by saving Richter from the control of Shaft, this forces a second castle to appear out of the sky directly above the one you're in, and it's, upside down.
This is one of the coolest moments to ever happen in a video game. And yet, it's something that I actually kind of dread playing the game now. But let's talk about that first statement before I get into my minor gripes with this castle.
When I was like 11 and saw this FMV appear, I was blown away. Alucard teleporting to a brand new castle was something I couldn't even fathom as a possibility. And yet here I was, in this brand new location. By flipping the castle upside down, they effectively doubled the length of the game, just like that. And at the time, I was all on board, because it just meant more Castlevania that I was getting to play, which was awesome. The goal of the inverted castle is to find Dracula's 5 relics.
That's right, yet another thing being brought forward from Simon's Quest. Best game ever.
And bring them to the center of the castle for the final confrontation with the Dark Lord himself. The relics are held by all the original legacy bosses from Castlevania 1, which I think is a nice touch. This is also where Death has been hanging out, meaning you can finally give him that sweet payback for stealing all your stuff at the start of the game. Since you're entering this new castle with all of Alucard's movement tech, you now have free reign to explore it as you wish. While you start in the reverse top floor, you can choose to take the left path to the reverse clock tower, then the reverse outer wall, and then the reverse library, or you could take your chances with the right path, leading to the reverse chapel. There's really nothing blocking you from any of the areas you want to go to, and they're all worth exploring, both to move the story along, but also to find the best equipment, by either reacquiring the thing stolen from you, or killing this one shmoo 1,000 times until it drops the sword you want, only for your muscle memory to betray you and make you screen transition before picking it up, making you kill another 1,000 shmoo. The reverse castle is truly the most open part of Symphony of the Night, and probably the most open part of any Castlevania going forward, for better or for worse. Purely from a level design standpoint, this is a pretty impressive feat. Level design is hard enough to do normally. Take a look at 99% of the levels made in Mario Maker if you don't believe me. That being said, the first castle's design is actually pretty awesome. I mean, there's a few lulls here and there, like this extremely long corridor in the Marble Gallery, but for the most part, navigating each area is pretty smooth. But the level designers had to go the extra mile and make sure that all of this worked when flipped completely upside down too. And it does. Sort of. And that's why I said it was a pretty impressive feat, as opposed to just being an impressive feat. Because while it's certainly playable, the smooth navigation and movement the first castle had is completely gone. And instead, you're just left sort of clunking around. You'll often find yourself needing to transform into the bat to slowly fly up through areas, or using the gravity boots assuming you found them. Enemy placement no longer feels like something that was well thought out, and instead they just kind of threw as many enemies on the screen at once as they could and called it a day. The design of some of these locations just doesn't work well when you're upside down. Inside the clock tower is such a mess to navigate now, and when you get outside, you just have this extremely long and empty corridor area that used to be where the sky was. All Roxas quarters suffer from the same fate. The reverse chapel is an extremely vertical section filled to the brim with so many enemies that it makes navigating it painfully slow. And that's not even including the area with the extremely long staircase where, now, because it's upside down, you have to use the bat to fly through, while your console of choice screams in pain at trying to load all the sprites that are trying to kill you.
Here's the thing though. I do think this is more of a problem on repeat playthroughs of the game. There's definitely novelty to this exploration, it's just that when you replay the game casually numerous times over the years, the inverted castle just starts to feel like kind of a slog to navigate through. Now, remember when I said we'd shelve the music thing until we're later in the video? Well, surprise, we're later in the video. In the first castle, every single area gets its own music track. So when you hear those tracks, you immediately think of those areas. The inverted castle did not get the same treatment, and instead it led to 2 songs in specific getting reused in multiple areas in the later part of the game. The first being Lost Painting, which I think is a great song, and it often makes me think of the reverse library, but it's also used in the Antechapel and the reverse caverns for some reason. The thing is not that the song doesn't fit those areas, it just doesn't feel as tailored to them as the normal castle counterparts. The identity is missing, and it becomes extremely obvious going from one area to another and hearing the same song. It just feels off, which brings me to the biggest culprit of this, Finale Toccata.
This song is a bit of a meme among Symphony of the Night fans, purely due to the fact that it is used so many times in the inverted castle. 6 times to be specific. 6 times. That's a lot. There is nothing more jarring than leaving an area, thinking you're entering a new one, only to hear the same song of the previous area start back up again. And depending on the path you choose to take in the inverted castle, this means that can happen to you multiple times too. It's a shame too, because it's not a bad song at all, but like any song you might place on loop, you're going to get tired of hearing it eventually. It's a 7-minute song too, with a long opening and a rather repetitive middle. It's entirely possible that you'll move through an entire area without ever getting to the meat of the song, only to have it immediately start over again. It's just a real shame, because all this tells me is that the inverted castle was probably more of an afterthought, and therefore quickly slapped on near the end of development, probably not giving the music team enough time to compose a unique track for each area again. The inverted catacombs and the reverse coliseum both get their own unique tracks, which is nice. It's just a bit of a bummer that so many other areas weren't as lucky.
So let's get back to the good things. I'm just going to take a minute to gush about some of the things I really like about Symphony of the Night before we get into the version differences.
Soten is a truly incredible experience your first time playing, and better yet, it's like a love letter to the Castlevania games that came before it. Slogra and Gaibon are the first boss you fight, and are clear callbacks to Super Castlevania 4. Later on, you fight against the Minotaur and Werewolf from Rondo of Blood, and then there's the Zombie Trio, representing the playable characters from Castlevania 3. Which is great seeing as they all have a direct connection to Alucard. Dracula's relics needed to reach the final area of the game are all clear callbacks to Simon's Quest, and each boss that holds them are the legacy bosses from Castlevania 1. I really love how this game pays tribute to what came before it, but without needing to pat itself on the back for doing so. Every location is absolutely gorgeous, and I cannot stress that enough. The backgrounds, the tile sets used to create the foreground for each area immerse you in these locations. They're all jam-packed with secrets and really make you want to explore them all. I think the underground caverns are my favorite location in the game, purely because of the aesthetic. It's like they broke the mold for what a cavern type level was supposed to be. Caverns in games are normally represented in these dark, almost spooky locations. The difficulty tends to ramp up and the music is typically a bit rougher. But Symphony of the Night doesn't care. It instead makes the underground caverns this jazzy, almost serene location. It's not dark, it's bright. So while you are underground, it doesn't feel like a stereotypical underground area in the slightest. Meanwhile, the journey through the clock tower is the complete opposite. The music here, the Tragic Prince, certainly sounds tragic for the first 17 seconds, before we get what I can only describe as a record scratch electric guitar coming in and completely changing the vibe of the area. The clock tower locations in these games have always been made to be these challenging gauntlets that you need to overcome, and while Symphony of the Night's clock tower isn't necessarily challenging, the music is constantly pushing you forward, almost invoking the feeling of a challenge, especially when that guitar solo near the end of the song hits.
I love that this game can make me feel things while playing it. Dodging Medusa heads and striking down harpies all while a guitar shreds in the background is absolute peak gaming. So then, you've explored both castles with Alucard, you've destroyed Dracula yet again, now what? Well, now it's time for Richter mode. And it's also finally time for *4gonBlitz. So I'm gonna let him take it away for a bit while I try to recover my voice.
Hi, my name is *4gonBlitz, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night is my favorite game of all time, and I've been speedrunning it for over 11 years now and hold many world records. Now then, let's talk about Richter. After completing a file and entering the name Richter on a new file, you can play through the entire game as Richter Belmont, complete with all of his moves from the prologue. Richter comes equipped with a Vampire Killer Whip, of course, giving him a much further reach than Alucard. He walks in his classic Belmont fashion, but double tapping forward will cause him to sprint. He could also perform a slide by holding down on the D-pad and then pressing the jump button. A second A press will then send Richter shooting horizontally into the air. Double tapping jump allows you to do a backflip. Pressing up on the D-pad, then down forward, and then attack will cause Richter to perform a whip tackle. This is also referred to as a blade dash by speedrunners. And this can be done numerous times in succession and even be performed in the air. It'll dash straight through any enemy in the game, doing a decent amount of damage to them as well. Pressing down, up, and then jump will have Richter perform a super jump with his whip, also damaging enemies in his path. This too can be performed multiple times. Richter also has access to using all the typical sub-weapons found throughout the castle, but unlike Alucard, has access to item crashes. These use more hearts but are powered up versions of the sub-weapon attacks. And when I say powered up, I mean they can kill a lot of bosses in just a single attack. The Richter playthrough has no story, but instead plays a bit more similarly to a classic Castlevania game. Richter cannot level up or use any items to adjust his stats, but he can find health ups. You could choose to fight most bosses in the game, or you could simply rush straight to the end. He doesn't need to do anything special to enter the inverted castle. He has access to it by simply going to the castle keep. To compensate for his lack of leveling up, Richter does actually do double damage to the enemies while in the inverted castle. Richter mode is certainly fun, but he is a bit of a glass cannon. At first you'll feel extremely overpowered, but when he gets hit, you tend to take a lot of damage. Though it's a great challenge for those wishing to beat the game as him. There's also Axe Armor mode that starts Alucard with the suit of old Axe Armor in his inventory. You can unlock this by entering Axe Armor as the file name. Unfortunately, unlike Portrait of Ruin, this isn't really a complete mode, and Axe Armor cannot be used to beat the game by itself. There are numerous areas where you'll have to take off the armor just to make jumps, but it is a fun little novelty for those that didn't find the armor in their normal playthrough. There's also a luck mode, which can be accessed by entering this code on the file select screen. This mode reduces all of Alucard's normal stats, but maxes out his luck stat, allowing you to find more unique items throughout your playthrough. Luck mode is also super important for speedruns of this game, as the optimal any % speedrun now uses the luck mode playthrough to use the fact that Alucard has lower stats to execute a technique called big tossing. This is where you lose more than half of your health in a single hit, and it sends you flying across the room. This movement option is incredibly fast and saves a ton of time in speedruns.
Oh, it's back to me? Oh, okay. So what about Maria? When I was a kid, I remember seeing pictures of her being playable in old magazines and ancient internet sites that I used to browse. I figured that if I entered the name Maria after beating the game, I'd gain access to her, but it never worked, because she wasn't playable in the original PlayStation release. The child version of me didn't realize that those screenshots were coming from the Sega Saturn version of the game, a version of the game that we would never get here in the West. So if you play the Sega Saturn version, then yes, you can play as Maria. In fact, you can play as Maria and Richter right from the start of the game. But we'll get to the other version differences later on.
If you've ever played Rondo of Blood, then you might be familiar with Maria, as she was the secondary playable character in that game. Here, though, she plays much differently than her younger self. Like Richter, she cannot level up nor use any items. However, she is actually equipped with the Dragon Helm, albeit something that the player cannot normally see. The Dragon Helm reduces the defense of all enemies by half, meaning Maria can do some serious damage. Maria doesn't come equipped with any weapon, instead she primarily uses her kicks. Double tapping forward will cause her to sprint, and she has access to a similar backdash to Alucard. Holding down and pressing jump will cause her to slide forward like Richter. Double tapping forward and then pressing attack will launch her forward with a kick attack. And Maria not only has a double jump, but also a triple jump as well. Holding down and pressing jump a final time after will cause her to perform a dive kick attack. She also has access to the standard super jump by pressing down, up, and jump. What really makes Maria unique is her use of spells and her 4 holy beasts. For whatever reason, she basically has a Mega Man X-style energy shot. Pressing the A button on the Saturn controller will cause her to shoot a projectile, and there's actually 4 levels of it depending on how long you hold the button down. Pressing down and doing a quarter circle forward on the D-pad, and then pressing attack will cause her to do the Guardian Knuckle attack, punching enemies with a ball of holy energy. Pressing up, down, quarter circle forward, and then pressing the attack summons her cat, allowing you to do a large flame burst attack. Sometimes their flames will appear gray, which doubles their damage output. Holding up for a few seconds, and then pressing forward, down, and attack summons her owl familiar. Pressing left, then doing a clockwise half circle on the D-pad, ending it right, and pressing attack summons her turtle, which acts as a heal. Pressing left, right, and then doing a clockwise half circle back to left, then quickly pressing right and attack will summon her dragon, which you can control the movements of while it's on the screen. And finally, her 4 holy beasts summon. This is performed by pressing up and then doing a full 360 clockwise on the D-pad back to up, holding it for a second and then pressing down and attack. This makes Maria completely invincible and doubles her damage on some of her attacks. But that's not all. Maria also has access to all of the sub-weapons that Alucard and Richter have, but even some of Maria's sub-weapons have been buffed for her playthrough. Maria is an absolute powerhouse to say the least. Her mode plays similar to Richter, meaning she is free to roam around the castle right away. You can go to any area and fight any boss in pretty much any order you wish, but she can't level up, and she gains health from health boosts. But considering the fact that you can cast spells to heal and be invincible, they aren't really that necessary for her. Also, like Richter, her damage output gets doubled when she's in the inverted castle to make up for her lack of leveling. If any of you out there have played the Dracula X Chronicle version of Soten, or perhaps you were introduced to Symphony of the Night through the release of Castlevania Requiem, then you might be thinking Maria looks completely different from what you're used to, and that's because she is. So while it is true that here in the West we never got to experience a playable Maria when she was first available, we actually did get to play as her once the game was ported and re-released both in the Dracula X Chronicles and the Castlevania Requiem, which is both based off the Dracula X Chronicles version. But wouldn't you know it, she plays completely differently here. Starting things off is Maria's standard attack. No longer does she kick, but instead throws out her owl. This is much more similar to her standard attack in Rondo of Blood, with you being able to throw out multiple birds at once, and even attack while moving. Pressing down and jump has her perform a slide attack, but it looks much different from her Saturn counterpart. Using either the L or R buttons, she can dash forward. This can be performed in the air, and even be chained together multiple times. She no longer has a triple jump, but does have a double jump complete with a dive kick if you press down and jump 1/3 time in mid-air. Pressing down, up, and then jump gives her access to a super jump, and if you continue to hold the button down, she will slowly float back down to the ground. Pressing up, down, quarter circle forward, and attack will cause Maria to perform a rolling attack, which can also be performed mid-air. Quite possibly the biggest change for Maria is how her 4 holy beasts and sub-weapons are handled. No longer does she have any of the spells from the Saturn version, nor does she have access to the same sub-weapons used by Alucard and Richter. Instead, just like in Rondo of Blood, her sub-weapons take the form of the 4 holy beasts, complete with her own unique item crashes. The first being her Cardinal, which causes 2 fiery wings to appear on either side of Maria, inflicting damage to whatever touches them. The item crash for this launches fireballs across the screen. The cat makes a return from Rondo, albeit being much larger now. It charges forward and will hit enemies multiple times. The item crash adds a Vorpal Blade effect to Maria's normal attack. The dragon has Maria throw a dragon horizontal across the screen, with the item crash looking similar to the dragon spell used in the Saturn version. The turtle acts as a shield that can block projectiles for a few seconds, with the item crash creating a black hole that acts similar to Alucard's Soul Steal, and similarly even heals Maria. Lastly is the doll, which uses her sprite from Rondo of Blood. This sub-weapon doesn't do anything when used normally, but the item crash summons her Guardian Knuckle to shoot out and rapidly punch enemies. I do find it a bit weird that they made this into a sub-weapon as opposed to allowing her to just have it like her younger counterpart, but I digress. As you can see, this version of Maria is practically a completely different character from what the Saturn version was. As for my personal preference, I prefer the Saturn Maria. She has a lot more fun and interesting moves. Her movement options are a lot more fun. I honestly have a hard time explaining it. I do like that the Dracula X Chronicle version seems to stay truer to how she's played in Rondo of Blood, but the Saturn version is almost like a fantastic representation of what if Maria truly mastered her abilities, because she's just so completely overpowered in that game. They're both different enough that I think they warrant trying though. Now you might be wondering, why did they go out of their way to make such a different version of Maria when the Saturn one was right there? Well, I don't have the real answer to that question. I do have my own speculation, which comes to the fact that the Saturn version of the game is often seen as the inferior port. But was it really?
That's right! We made it to the Saturn version! Finally! Just do me a favor, because I'm sure by this point, my voice is probably going, so just don't look at that runtime, would you? Hey! I said don't look! So here's the thing with the Sega Saturn version of Symphony of the Night. If you grew up with the PlayStation 1 version, or even the Xbox 360 version, then the Sega Saturn version was like this mythical what-if version that everybody wanted to get their hands on. I know I certainly did. I used to obsess over those pictures in magazines and on the internet, and I'd watch like really low quality 144p fuzzy video footage of the new areas and just hype myself up about it for years. For decades, honestly. Going back to development for a little bit, the PlayStation 1 version was actually made by Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo. Think of this as Konami's A-team for development, handling a lot of their bigger IPs at the time. The Saturn version was made by Konami Computer Entertainment Nagoya, who made Castlevania Legends. That's not meant to be a slight at that dev team. Just pointing out that the port for the Saturn version was not made by the original dev team, and sometimes that shows. Let's break down the differences, shall we?
First of all, most notably from starting a fresh file, you now have the option to immediately pick one of 3 characters, Richter, Alucard, or Maria. There's also a unique Richter sprite that you can choose to use as well. Next up, we have a handful of unique items, such as the Godspeed shoes, a relic that lets Alucard finally run at a speed that's still slower than backdashing, but that movement speed carries over to your jumps, which is pretty cool. It also kind of makes performing certain spells harder, because you have to double tap forward to run, and this seems to want to eat the inputs that you might have intended to use for a spell, so whoops. Alongside that, there's a couple other unique items, like the Glaring Cloth, Alucard Spear, and Astral Knife. Another pretty great addition is the Maria boss fight. Now, when you journey to the center of the castle to acquire the Holy Glasses, as opposed to Maria just giving them to you, you instead have to fight her, and overall, this is a pretty great boss fight. Her theme is fantastic, and almost sounds like it might have inspired some Hollow Knight music down the line. Throughout the game, there's a couple of new tracks that can be heard, including remixed tracks from previous Castlevania games. Starting as Maria, for instance, changes the Dracula's castle song at the start to be a version of Vampire Killer instead.
And of course, there's the thing that I was the most excited about, and in fact, most people who haven't played the Saturn version are probably the most excited about: the new areas and the new enemies. And boy, do these new areas exist.
At the start of the game, no matter what version you're playing on, you might have noticed this little hatch here. Well, in the Saturn version, you can get this to open up. I believe it actually opens up immediately upon meeting death, which is actually pretty crazy. Going down into this hatch will lead you to the underground garden, which was probably the most hyped up location. The music is yet another version of Vampire Killer, which is a little strange to use it twice.
It's especially weird if you're playing as Maria, because then you get to hear two versions of the same song from two connecting areas, but I guess that's still better than hearing 6 versions of the same finale toccata.
When you first enter, the only way to go is down. Immediately to the left is a brand new teleporter, for those of you who might have come here too early and can't make it all the way to the end. As you traverse to the right, you'll encounter some unique enemies, such as these flying fish, and of course the human-faced tree, which is easily the best enemy in the game. There's a save point to the far right, but without the bat relic, you actually cannot complete this area. If you do have it, you can venture up. The next couple of screens are full of some unique garden-themed enemies, and I guess this is supposed to be some sort of greenhouse? I'm not the biggest fan of how this area looks, especially because I think the first part of the underground garden looks pretty great, and I kinda wish they just expanded that some more. To the far right is a unique boss fight against the skeleton leader, with a remixed version of Bloody Tears playing. It's a fun fight, but he uses probably the worst looking attack in the game, just shooting this completely rectangular horizontal beam at you. And I mean, I can defend a lot of this stuff, but this is pretty hard to defend. It just looks bad. But if you beat him, you get your health up, and that's it. That's the underground garden. I'll give my opinions on the new areas after I explain the next one though. Next up, we have the Cursed Prison. If you've ever played the Saturn version and you're in the Marble Gallery, you might have noticed this additional door right here. This leads to the Cursed Prison, and I'm going to explain why that's stupid in just a minute. When I first saw this, I was so excited. A new door? Here? What a great place for a new door, because otherwise, I've always found this particular part of Marble Gallery to be a bit pointless, since it just loops back to the castle entrance. So adding a new location here seems like such a genius play. But in practice, let's see what happens. So when I got here, playing relatively casually, I was level 8. I found the door, I walked through it and into this brand new area. I worked my way to the right, killing all the enemies, and I noticed I was leveling up every single time. One screen transition to the right, and I'm at a dead end. So I have to walk back to the left. I kill all the enemies on my way out, and by the time I make it back through the door I entered, I was level 20. 20. I went up 12 levels from fighting enemies that are extremely accessible to anyone playing the game casually. So how is this supposed to work? Well, the Cursed Prison connects to 2 locations, the Marble Gallery and the Underground Caverns. If you go to the Underground Caverns and work your way to the left, as opposed to dropping all the way down, there's a new door there. Entering this door will put you at the true entrance to the Cursed Prison. This area has you moving back and forth horizontally as you make your way down, fighting off all the exact same enemies that are found inside the start of the Underground Caverns and even in the Marble Gallery. There are some unique items in these urns, such as the Astral Dagger, but then you end up hitting the dead-end wall I mentioned earlier. But on this side of the wall, there's a button that lowers it, acting as a shortcut back to the Marble Gallery. Now, making your way to the left, you're back in the area I first described that contains all the new enemies, which, by the way, are much stronger and give way more EXP than the enemies you were just fighting. So this begs to question, why? What was the point? I'm genuinely trying to view this from a game dev side of things, but there are still issues here that could have easily been fixed. First of all, let's address the fact that I understand why they can't have you simply enter the door from the Marble Gallery, work your way through the Cursed Prison out the Underground Caverns. I get it, because you're not supposed to be able to get to that location without the Jewel of Open. Doing so would break the flow of this part of the game. Sure, ultimately you wouldn't be able to get anywhere new still, since you couldn't exit to the top, so you'd eventually have to work your way through the caverns back to the entrance. But it would render tying this area to the Jewel of Open pointless, so I get it. But why did they let the players experience the new and stronger monsters immediately at the start of the game, but fill the rest of the prison with monsters we've already seen? In fact, why even let us go that far to begin with? They could have gotten around this by doing what was done in the Colosseum, which would be moving the dead end wall much farther to the left, making it so you can simply peek into the area but can't take part in the area. The way it is now, not only are you spoiled on the new monsters that appear here, but then you're doubly disappointed that they don't even appear in the actual entrance location, and instead you're just fighting things from the previous locations. Why not have those new gargoyles and ghosts on this screen? It's just extremely odd and tells me that this location wasn't playtested enough. I will say, the music here is nice though, and reminds me of Sultan Sanctuary. I know that some people have complained about the cursed prison not leading anywhere new, and that it's a bit lame connecting the marble gallery into the underground caverns, but I would like to speak on defense of the devs here. Ultimately, their hands were most likely tied with what they could add. As I mentioned earlier already, allowing access to new locations too soon could break the flow of the game. I think, aesthetically speaking, the location of the map is perfect. It's really cool that we have this bridge between the two areas, and Castlevania having a prison of sorts just makes sense. I'd just have liked to have seen it be a bit less linear, and have the monsters shuffled some. Both of these locations make a return in the inverted castle, of course, with the garden now being the inverted garden. There are more new enemies here as well, and the music is a version of Castlevania 3's beginning, which is cool. There is no boss at the end of the area, but you can find a weapon. As for the prison, well, it's here again. It probably fits the inverted castle more now, since the inverted castle is completely open to the player. This gives you another path to navigate through the castle, so it actually works better here than it did in the base normal castle.
Let's move on to the elephant in the room. The bugs.
Soten on the Saturn is often spoken poorly of, due to the fact that the PlayStation and Sega Saturn have much different hardware. This means that first and foremost, the Saturn version has a lot more loading. The loading screens are a bit longer, and there are even extra loads such as right here. This apparently bothers people, but personally, load times in older games never bothered me. I owned plenty of PS1 games with stupid long load times and still love them to death, even today. It's just something that I came to expect, so having a couple more isn't really an issue. Graphically speaking though, the Saturn wasn't able to handle transparency all that well, leading to the form of mist looking, well, like this. Even the waterfall in the underground cavern suffers from this. There's a few other spots too, but it's definitely the most noticeable with the form of mist. Transparency on the Saturn certainly wasn't impossible, since we see it used later in the game, and even on the Skeleton Leader's weird dumb attack that has transparency on it. But that's also why it's probably such a simple shape, because it had to be simple. The Saturn is also at a different resolution than the PlayStation. So as opposed to properly resizing the game, they just kind of stretched it to fit, so the sprites don't look as great.
All in all, when the Sega Saturn version gets brought up, people either love it or they really hate it. But I want to ask the people that don't like it if they've played it recently, or at all even, or if they're just echoing what other people have said, because honestly, it's fine. It's great even. And I think that it gets entirely too much ridicule. Transport yourself back to 1998. You're a kid, you love Castlevania, and you own a Sega Saturn. Your parents get you the hot new Castlevania, you pop it in to play it. Are you really going to be like, oh, this resolution looks wrong? Or, what's with the total lack of transparency? Oh my god, they use dithering? Ugh, what's with these two subpar areas? No, of course not, because nobody would do that. Nobody thought that. I can almost guarantee that the kids that were playing this game for the first time in the Sega Saturn were just as happy as the kids that were playing it for the first time on the PlayStation. Hell, they were probably bragging about all the extra content they had, because back in 1998, people weren't as picky with the games that they had, nor as judgmental, because there wasn't such a huge influx of games for them to make these comparisons to. In fact, I've got an entire video on that exact topic, but the point is, I feel like a lot of the complaints people make with the Saturn version of the game today are just regurgitated opinions that they didn't form themselves.
Before I ever got my hands on the Saturn version, I definitely built it up in my head, yeah, but over the years, I'd heard plenty of nitpicking and complaining about it too. So I went into it knowing people didn't like it, and you know what? I felt like a kid again. I was playing this familiar game that I know like the back of my hand, but there was new content in it. I honestly didn't care that it wasn't perfect because it was new, and the wonder of it was still there for me. So yeah, I genuinely like the Saturn version because it gave me a fresh experience.
And yes, I know that Iga himself says he didn't like the Saturn version of the game and didn't like the new additions, but he also says that he hates Circle the Moon, and I love that game, so I have to take some of those complaints with a grain of salt. I do see his perspective though, because when you make things, it's your baby, it's yours, you made it. So when people come along and make changes and make additions without your involvement, it can feel wrong. So I get where he's coming from, but it doesn't change my opinion on what the Saturn devs did. I think they probably did the best with the timelines that they were probably given. They were handed a game that they didn't even make and were told to somehow improve it and make it better. And I think that that would be difficult for anyone. So yeah, I think they did just fine. I have in my script here highlighted write about the Xbox 360 versions here. I apparently didn't do that. But I did write 24 pages about everything else. There's really not much more to talk about. I already kind of mentioned that earlier. It doesn't have the full motion video, and some of the sound effects are kind of crunchy sounding because they had to like compress the game a lot more. And the loads, when you like get an HP up after you beat a boss, it loads in really fast. On the PlayStation version, it loads in really painfully slow. There's probably some other stuff, but let's just move on because I'm not writing anymore and I'm already losing my voice. Moving on, I definitely feel like we have to talk about the Dracula X Chronicles version on the PSP, which coincidentally was the version used in the Requiem collection that came out later on the PS4. There are certainly some big changes here, and definitely some things that I think are worth mentioning.
One of the most glaring changes to the fans of the PlayStation and 360 versions of the game is the fact that the Dracula X Chronicles version has a new localization, complete with new voice actors for cutscenes. There were certainly quite a lot of people bothered by this, if only because the original voices and lines were so iconic. But ultimately, there's just a small amount of dialogue in this game that I wouldn't consider it something to really gripe over if you don't like the new ones. The weirdest thing is not hearing Alucard's deep, bassy voice provided by Robert Belgrade, as it's been replaced by Yuri Lowenthal. I don't think Yuri did a bad job by any means, but I definitely prefer Robert's voice. As mentioned earlier, there's a playable version of Maria now, with her being based more on her Rondo of Blood moveset. She appears as a boss for Alucard, similar to the Sega Saturn version, albeit with a different theme and moveset. Still a nice addition though. Due to being on the PSP, and therefore lacking 4 shoulder buttons, the moveset had to be changed around a bit. Normally the transformations are tied to your shoulder buttons, but with the PSP only having 2, that means to transform into Fog, you need to press L and R at the same time. It's a little awkward, but it works. However, the real travesty is the fact that they used this version in Castlevania Requiem. Konami didn't even bother to fix this, so when you play it on a PS4, while you physically have enough buttons, the transformations are still performed in the same manner as the PSP, but we'll get more into the PS4 version in a moment. The PSP version does have some audio issues here and there, as well as some graphical issues, but on such a small screen, I think they're a lot less noticeable. I sure hope that nobody decides to lazily port this forward to appear on large screen TVs in the future.
Oh hey look, they ported it forward, and now those small graphical issues are way more noticeable because it's on a TV.
Yeah, so in 2018, Konami released Castlevania Requiem, which is a collection of Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night. As I mentioned a moment ago, this version was based on the Dracula X Chronicles version, meaning it has the same pros and cons as the PSP, but, well, actually it has more cons because all things considered, it's just a lazy port. The fact that Konami didn't bother to fix the issue with the shoulder buttons bugs the hell out of me, but the graphical issues are also way more noticeable. Take for instance this transparency here when you venture behind the waterfall in the underground caverns. This looks atrocious.
Also, I purposely said Konami didn't bother to fix this, because just like with the Saturn version, Iga had no involvement in the Requiem collection. Iga had already left the company in 2014, and had started work on his Castlevania spiritual successor, Bloodstained, which yes, I will eventually cover all of those at some point in the future, sometime. But point is, he had no involvement with Requiem, so the issues with that game are not on him and fall squarely in the hands of Konami. I don't think playing Soten on the PS4 is bad by any means, it's just not as good as the original, because it's a port of a port, and when you start porting ports, things like Requiem's issues happen. But if it's your only way to play the game, it's absolutely worth grabbing. You have full permission to call me out for not being as thorough as I initially had planned on being when I wrote all this and planned on doing this video and everything, but I have written here, talk about the phone version here. And then I didn't write anything under that spot. I mean, I wrote stuff, but not anything about the phone version. So, whoops, I'm already recording. I've been recording for over 3 hours now. It's a version. It's on Android and iOS, and you can play it. It's honestly not bad if you want to play it, you know, without tactile feedback and you want to play it on your phone. There's not much more to say about it. It's not like the Saturn version or the PSP version where they're like so radically, you know, there's all these crazy things. It's there. It exists. So, sorry for not going more in depth on the phone versions, but, whoops, my bad.
I cannot believe I'm doing this, but I messed around with the phone versions a little bit more, and because of that, I decided I was going to go ahead and insert this into the video mere hours before uploading it on YouTube. You can actually confirm that because this section, me speaking to you all right now, does not exist in the Patreon version that I uploaded 2 days ago. So, whoops. Anyway, this whole thing real fast is just off the cuff. There is no script, so I just want to talk about some things I noticed. The phone versions of the game were built off of the Requiem version, which in turn were built off of the PSP Dracula X Chronicles version, so yes, that means they are a port of a port of a port. I played them on 2 different phones. An iPhone 15 Pro Max. Right from the start of the game, you can actually play as Alucard, Richter, or Maria. And of course, this is the PSP Maria, not the Saturn Maria. There are some shortcuts on the touchscreen for doing some of the special moves, such as Maria's slide or Richter's whip tackle. The game plays pretty flawlessly on an iPhone. The graphics look great, the music sounds fine, but it does have those gross, crunchy sound effects that were used in the PSP version of the game. Lastly, when playing it on my phone, which is the Galaxy S23 Ultra, I noticed the game ran ridiculously fast. This footage is not sped up. The music actually runs at a normal tempo, but the gameplay itself was super fast. I spoke to Dragonblitz about this, and he let me know that the reason is because the game goes off of your phone's internal speed. So because I have my phone set at 120 FPS, the game is running at 120 FPS. So he let me know that I could just put the phone in battery saver mode, and this would make it so the game would run at a normal speed and not ridiculously fast. So yeah, it looks like there was a little bit more to talk about with the phone versions than I initially let on when I first recorded the video. So sorry that I had to do it this way, but you know, it is what it is. All right, back to the video. Thanks. But there's still another version that I need to talk about. Well, I don't need to, but I want to. And that's the famed Tiger Electronics Game.com version. For those of you who are younger than me, and according to my YouTube analytics, that's like 70% of you, Tiger Electronics used to make these little LCD handheld electronic video games. I had a couple of Sonic ones and a Simon's Quest one when I was a kid, but have unfortunately lost them with time. They were extremely basic battery-powered games using essentially a calculator screen. They weren't great, but I loved them anyway. In 1997, Tiger Electronics released a full handheld console called the Game.com, and from what I've seen, it was not great. I never owned one, so I can't judge too harshly. But you can bet your ass I'd buy one if I didn't have to pay eBay prices for one. But regardless, at some point in time, Castlevania Symphony of the Night was going to be ported to it. For years, nobody had actually ever seen it, and the only reference to it were a couple of screenshots on the internet and in old gaming magazines. Then, abruptly in 2022, a guy by the name of Discman posted a video of him playing it to YouTube, which collectively blew the minds of Soten fans everywhere. Even better though, was the fact that he managed to dump his copy and release it on the internet. Soten on the Tiger Electronics Game.com is both frustratingly bad and yet an absolute marvel at the same time. I'm not even kidding when I say that this is a bit of a technical marvel. The Game.com, it might be called the Gamecom. I don't know. It's got a period between game and com, so Game.com. This handheld is only just barely better than that of an old Tiger Electronics handheld, being similar to playing games on those old TI-83 scientific calculators. And yet, when you look at Symphony of the Night on this thing, it actually looks really good. Alucard's animations are a lot more fluid than they have any right to be. In fact, the entire game is just a lot better than it has any right to be. While the game is still just a prototype, it's essentially a nearly complete prototype. We're talking full cutscenes, menus, equipable items, a map showcasing each area in the game. The gold and silver ring are both here, meaning you can get the holy glasses to fight Richter. The inverted castle is in the game as well, including its mini bosses, Shaft and Dracula both. There's even a full ending cutscene. It's definitely rough around the edges though. The controls are pretty stiff, the hitboxes are awkward, the jump is both floaty but also feels like you're stuck in a quagmire. And of course, there is one song that plays for the entire duration of the game. It's not finished, but you can tell it was very close to being finished. And with just a little more time, they probably could have ironed out some of the smaller issues. It's honestly a bit of a masterpiece considering the hardware it was made for. It's a shame that there were real human game developers that worked and probably put many hours into making this game as functional as it is, only for it to never see the light of day officially. But at the same time, had this game actually come out, it probably would have performed extremely poorly sales-wise due to the fact that nobody's really trying to get their hands on the Tiger Electronic Game.com back in 1997. Instead, it became this secret treasure that Castlevania fans dreamed of getting their hands on. It was a mythical what-if game that a lot of people believed to only be mock-up concept images, when in actuality it was a fully fledged, nearly complete game. Due to all of that, I think it's given fans of the series a deeper appreciation of the work that those mystery developers put into making this than they would have gotten had it been released in 1997 and promptly forgotten about like so many other Game.com games. That being said, I highly recommend you check out DragonBlitz's entire playthrough of the game over on his channel. And if you're wanting even more coverage
of the Symphony of the Night Game.com version, go check out the Stop Skeletons from Fighting video because it's also really in-depth and it's just a great watch. So I'll link both of those down below. Symphony of the Night means a lot to me. I mean, clearly, as this is the longest script I've ever written for the channel. And yet, it's not my favorite Castlevania. But to be honest, I don't even know if I have a favorite. There's all these weird factors that stand out on subsequent playthroughs of the game that always kind of dampen the experience from a casual playthrough perspective. First and foremost, it's entirely too easy to get overpowered in this game. Once you know where everything is, or know what spells you have access to, it's over. I don't like having to put restrictions on my playstyle because of having that knowledge.
Adding RPG elements into a video game always means there's going to be a way to break it, but it's most noticeable here as opposed to the later games. Circle of the Moon, for instance, I've played countless times, but the twin dragon zombies can still be considered a difficult boss. Soten, though, I feel so many bosses, especially in the second castle, exist only for a few seconds before being utterly destroyed by one of the many overpowered weapons. And yet, I can't really fault the game for that either, because I know this is more of a personal issue. Similarly though, is the movement. Alucard moves so slow for the entire game. Even if you're playing the Saturn version and get the Godspeed shoes, it's still not a huge improvement. But you know what is? Shield dashing. i.e., pressing the backdash button and shield button back and forth to cancel the animation and scoot along backwards through the game, and I both love and hate this. I don't dislike it because of why some other people dislike it, which ultimately boils down to either not understanding how to do it or simply being bad at it, but I dislike it for the same reason I mentioned disliking the dash mechanic in Harmony of Dissonance. It's too good, and it utterly replaces the normal movement style. I just don't want to play a game constantly pressing a single button to move, or in this case, constantly pressing 2 buttons, but without doing so, I just feel like the movement is ridiculously slow. The later Castlevania games did fix this by adding in late game abilities, giving characters the ability to dash, hell with Circle of the Moon doing so right from the start. And yet again, I know that I can't really fault this game too hard for this either, because this is the first of its kind. Any, and by any I mean every game is going to have flaws, especially when it's reinventing itself the way Castlevania did, so I know I can't be too hard on it. But I'd be remiss if I wasn't honest with my opinions either.
But that's where the legacy of this game comes in. Because pound for pound, there is not a single Castlevania game that has left as big of an impact on the general public as Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
You might have noticed that I've said things like casual and vanilla while describing this game. That's because over the years, fans of Symphony of the Night have built amazing speedrunning and randomizer communities that are still very active, with new strategies and ways to play the game being found even up to 2024. Personally, while I do enjoy speedrunning certain games, I definitely gravitate more towards randomizers when it comes to replaying this game. Soten was always one of those games that I wished I could somehow wipe from my memory and play it completely fresh. And while that isn't really possible, the advent of randomizers have really breathed fresh life into this game for me, as now I can shuffle all sorts of variables around and be forced to play the game in new ways. I won't just drift towards the same overpowered weapons right from the start of the game, and might be forced to use something entirely new instead. I didn't really get into it earlier, but Symphony of the Night really does have a lot of different weapons, but I've always felt that so many of them go unused or even unfound if they drop from specific enemies. Playing a randomizer fixes that entirely. And I'm far from the only person who feels this way either, which is why I'm going to toss it back over to Dragonblitz.
I mean, the randomizer for this game completely reinvigorated a huge part of my interest for this game as well. When the randomizer came out, I had already been speedrunning the game for about, must have been like 7 years. I must have been already speedrunning the game for about 7 years. I had many world records at this point and was struggling to find new ways to enjoy the game. And then Wild Mouse created a item and relic randomizer that is still being used to this day, and people continue to add to it and update it. That randomizer really did kick off a lot for me, both for my YouTube and streaming, as well as just my own personal enjoyment of the game.
When I was writing the script, or hell, even now as I record it, and probably even in the future while I'm editing it, I've had this sense of dread about releasing this video. Dread is probably too strong of a word, but I was worried that I wouldn't be able to properly convey my feelings about this game. The initial excitement and joy when I first played Castlevania Symphony of the Night was on a whole other level. I adored this game when I first played it. It felt gigantic, but not overbearing. It was a game that I was constantly thinking about when I was at school, and I just couldn't wait to get home to play it. It essentially re-sparked my love of the Castlevania series as a whole. The artwork and the music are perfect in my eyes, and the sprites clearly inspired the later DS devs as well. There are so many good things about this Castlevania, but I just can't call it my favorite. Over the years, I've always found myself gravitating towards replaying the 6 handheld games, or the 3 NES classic games, over playing Soten again. It's not that I don't replay it, I mean hell, I did just talk about the randomizer for it, it's just that I don't visit it as much as the other games. I really wish I could give a better reason as to why, but I guess to me it just feels like the later games really perfected the formula. Symphony of the Night was truly a rock solid foundation for the other Castlevanias to build upon. I don't want people walking away from this assuming that I dislike the game, because that's not true. I really do love it. I think everybody should play this game, especially if you're just now getting into the Castlevania series with any of the most recent collections that have been dropping.
The impact that Symphony of the Night has had on video games as a whole is monumental. When people think Castlevania, they typically think Symphony of the Night. When stores like Fangamer start selling Castlevania-themed merchandise, what they're really selling is Symphony of the Night-themed merchandise. Since to the general audience, the word Castlevania has become synonymous with Symphony of the Night. Countless video games, both AAA and indie, have been inspired by the look, feel, and playstyle of it. It goes without saying that it's easily one of the most important games of all time. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear what *4gonBlitz has to say before we wrap this whole thing up.
It really did come from a time where the design philosophy for games was, I don't know, is it a cool idea? If it is, just throw it in the game. Like, there's so many secrets and Easter eggs that don't have any connection to the overall game. They just exist because when they showed up that day and said, hey, what should we add to this part of the game? Someone came up with an idea, they thought it was cool, and they added it in. The confessional booth in the chapel is a great example of that. It is just an Easter egg. It doesn't really change much. At best, it gives you the grape juice item, if you're lucky. It's like a 1 in 22 chance when you sit down. The attention to detail there to just add something cool for the sake of adding something cool there is something that I think many games lack in the modern era. I don't know. I just love this game. I really do. It's been a huge part of my life as long as I can remember. And now I've made a career out of playing this game well. So that gives it extra sentimentality to me nowadays. Even when I play other Castlevania games, I do enjoy myself, but there is something just so special about Symphony of the Night.
There's a reason that once I started writing the script for this video, it ended up being 24 pages long. There's a reason as to why I wanted to bring *4gonBlitz on here to help me cover this game. And it's because I wanted to give Castlevania Symphony of the Night its proper respects. I wanted to do it justice, not only explaining my thoughts and feelings on it, but the insane impact it's had over the years, which, if I'm being honest, I barely even scratched the surface of because I just kind of ran out of time and writing and recording all of this. So again, while it isn't my favorite Castlevania, it is one of my favorite games. I love this game and I love this series, and if I keep talking anymore, I'm not going to have a voice. So ultimately, I think I've said all that I need or can say on it at the time. How do you feel about Castlevania Symphony of the Night? Is it your favorite game? Do you have a favorite version? Let me know down in the comments. And lastly, of course, I want to give a huge shout out to *4gonBlitz again for coming on here and sharing his knowledge and helping me with this just absolutely gigantic video. He's got 2 channels here on YouTube, as well as a Twitch stream, which again, I will link down below. I highly recommend checking out his content over on *4gonBlitz Daily. With that being said, my name is AJ, and this was just another video about Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
Hey guys, so I just spent 4 hours straight recording this video. It has been a monumental task. I wrote this script at the end of 2023, and I've been dreading ever recording. I knew that it was going to take me a very long time to get through, and it did. It took me 4 hours. All I want to say is I appreciate everybody here who made it to the end, and while I normally don't ask this, I'm going to for this time, but please, if you managed to make it this far, just hit the stupid subscribe thing, hit the stupid thumbs up, leave a comment, share the video, do all the stupid YouTube stuff, because I'm really proud of this video, even though I feel like I could have done even better, and I could have gone more into detail on things, but I'm happy with it, or else I wouldn't be posting it, right? So just do me a favor, just, do all the things, and watch one of these other videos here, because if you watch them, then, YouTube's algorithm's like, oh, look at this, they watched multiple videos from him, that means, we should spread his stuff a lot more, so that'd be cool. Just do me that solid, that'd be great. I'm gonna go die now. Thanks again so much. Thanks. Alright, that's all I got. Bye.